I sat down to consider the two questions we were asked to answer of how Dave impacted my life and what I appreciated about Dave, and I struggled with where to start. In the grand scheme of life, I knew Dave for a very brief period of 8 years. But in those 8 years, there were jam-packed with memories of Dave, not only as a friend, but also as a fellow UGM employee whose office was right next door. The combination of thin walls and close proximity often brought Dave and I into each other's offices, where we would spend hours talking about life, talking about hardships, talking about families, about dreams, about heartbreaks. Our conversations would always conclude with a reminder from Dave of how great our God is. On April 28th, I had the opportunity to spend an hour with Dave in his hospice room. And I walked from that meeting just like I walked from all of our other meetings in the past, full of hope and feeling blessed beyond measure for having such a wonderful and God-centered friend. I had heard that Dave wasn't doing very well on the days leading up to our meeting, so I had prepared myself what I expected would be a very brief and heartbreaking meeting. Just like most of the other meetings I had with Dave, I had to wait in line as the person ahead of me was not ready to say goodbye to him yet. As the last person left the room, Dave turned towards me, and at that same person who had always been with me with his full attention was once again fully engaged in wanting to know how I was doing, what I was doing, how my family was. Here's a man with terminal cancer concerned about me. That was so Dave. I would oftentimes see him stopping outside the mission doors, talking to the person on the sidewalk, and I'm sure he was sharing the hope that he had in Jesus Christ with that person. I never seen Dave turn his back on the opportunity to share that hope, and it truly had a huge impact on me. Recently, I shared one of my most memorable stories with Olivia that David asked me to repeat to him during our 1-hour meeting, and I will share it with you because it describes Dave fully, and what I will always remember him as. Just about 3 years ago, I was going through a very difficult time in my prayer life when I was really questioning God, thinking I must be wasting my time. Because though I was spending at least an hour each morning in the Word, praying and journaling, I wasn't feeling God. I was feeling as if God had abandoned me. One morning, as I sat at my prayer table, which faces out to my front yard, I cried out and asked God to reveal himself to me. At about that same time, as I cried out, a small bird, a sparrow, landed on my windowsill, on the ledge of the window screen that barely had anywhere to grab onto. I thought it was a little odd that this bird would do this, but thought nothing more of it. Later that day, Dave and I were talking, and I was sharing my frustrations with things and how I was not feeling God's presence. I then shared with him the odd thing that had happened with the bird on landing on my windowsill. Dave, with a tear in his eye, said, "Mike, do you know what God says about the sparrow and about how much he cares for them and how much more he cares for you? God answered your prayer and revealed himself to you." Dave had that way about him. Where I was looking for the big sign from God, Dave was able to point out the little thing that I overlooked when I cried out to God. That has been great comfort for me over these past couple of months as I struggled when Dave was sick, asking, "Why, God?" Knowing that though I don't understand the why of God, I know he cares for me and he cares for all of us. He cares for you too. Today, whenever I see a sparrow, I think of Dave. Just like I think of Dave every time I see a Jimmy John's. I am so grateful for that hour I spent with Dave as I was reminded of how, even the darkest of days, we can remain hopeful and know that God is always in control. I love you, Dave Wall, and cannot wait to sit down with you again.